Hello and welcome to MHA Digital Communities. My name's Katie and today we're going to be exploring the world of the seashore. We're going to be doing some different paintings and we're going to start off by learning to experiment with different textures using watercolour. So first of all, I'm going to take you through the materials that you will need. If you have a set of watercolours, that's great, you can use those, but you can also use things like food colouring and inks if you don't have watercolours. Then you will need just a couple of different brushes. I like to have a small one and a medium one like this. You'll need a pencil, a ruler, some thick paper. This is just cartridge paper, you could also use card. I've also got a wax crayon. If you don't have that, you can always use a candle or even one of those little birthday candles. I've got an old toothbrush, which we're going to be using as a brush, some washing up liquid, a little bit of instant coffee, a little bit of salt. I've just decanted these into small jars. I've got a straw, and I've also got a small palette here. If you don't have one of these types of round palettes, you can use something like a plate or even an ice cube tray, those kinds of things that are useful, or just paper cups. I've got a couple of old jam jars here that I'm going to use. One of them I'm going to use for my water for painting with, and the other one I'm going to use for some bubble painting, which we'll be doing down the line. I've also got a little artist sponge. You can just use a normal washing up piece of sponge, and it's quite handy to have a little bit of paper towel on hand should you have any spillages, although I haven't put any out here. Okay then, so let's get started. So for the first piece, I'm going to take you through some really useful techniques that are going to be great for you to create a seashore seascape type painting. So to start off with, we're just going to take our piece of paper and we're going to divide it into 8 different sections. You don't have to be super careful with the measuring, just really put a line halfway along. So you can divide your paper into quarters and then just put another line in as well. Okay, doesn't matter that the sections are slightly different sizes, that's fine. Okay, so on my sketchbook here, I quite like to just write down what I'm going to do. You don't have to do that, but it just kind of helps me plan out my space. So for the first experiment, what I'd like you to do is use your pencil and draw a series of small circles in your first section. When I say to people, draw some circles, people think, oh, it's difficult to draw a circle. They don't have to be perfect circles at all. They can be quite scribbly and loose. And I'm just trying to do a series of different sizes. It's just quite nice as a little warm-up to just draw those. And don't worry if they're not perfect circles. It doesn't matter. It's just to really get that effect. And once you've done that, take your wax crayon or your wax candle, whichever one you want to use, and then just go into the circles and just very roughly put some wax on there. So this technique is called wax resist, and it's quite satisfying to do. So once I've done that, I'm going to take my paintbrush. I've got my slightly larger paintbrush. I'm going to dip it in the water, just bringing my palette closer. Now my palette already had a little bit of ink in, and that doesn't matter. If yours is completely clean, that's better. Okay, but that's fine. Okay, so I'm going to basically go into my blue and load up some paint. Okay, as soon as you've done that, you can then start to add a wash, which is basically a thin layer of paint, and you can see what happens. The areas where the wax is repel the water, and so you get that showing through. This is just quite a pale colour. It's often good just to start off a little bit paler. Then if you want to add a darker shade, when I add the watercolour onto the page that's already wet, you start to get this effect of the paint slightly bleeding out. it's just quite nice to kind of watch that as it merges in. You could go a little darker by even adding a little bit of black. I wouldn't normally add too much, but you can see it makes quite a nice darker area. Okay, so you're starting to get this watery, bubbly effect, and that's the first experiment. Okay, so now we're ready for the second experiment. So the second experiment is where you're going to use your wax crayon or your candle to create really thin stripes. Now it's a bit difficult because in the sense of being able to see it, because you're doing basically white on white. And what I'm doing is I'm going along and trying not to take it off the page. So I'm just going along to try and get this flowy back and forth line. And this is really good for hand and eye coordination, which is what a lot of these exercises are very good for, hand and eye coordination. So we've done that, and then as you can see on my example, I've got kind of different colours going on. So the way we're going to do that is I just rinse my brush, and I'll start off with my paler blue. Then I'm going to add a little bit of the darker blue. In different bands, so I'll just put some there. I'm rinsing it out between colours just so I don't mess up my watercolours. And then I'm going to get a tiny little bit of yellow, which will then, just going to drop bits in here and there. Okay, so when I compare this one to the one I did before, I can see there's a little bit more wax on this one, so it's got a little bit more of a linear texture, but that's okay. You know, you're just experimenting, and each one will come out differently each time you do it. Okay, so then for the next one, I'm calling that one wax and pencil swirls and paint. So I've got 2 layers of lines going on this one. Start off with your pencil and have fun just doing some swirls. This one I'm actually going to try doing it with a candle instead of the wax crayon, just to see what the difference is. So I'm basically doing a second layer, just using the wax candle. So when you get watercolour paint and you get enough of it and you add a little bit of water, you can create pretty much a good amount that you can use for quite a few experiments. So I'm going to add that one in. Okay, so already I can tell that the candle does repel the watercolour a lot better than the wax crayon, probably because it's got a higher content of wax, I would imagine. So that definitely I think is clearer, isn't it, in terms of the lines. I'm rinsing my brush, go back to my yellow, and then just here and there I'm going to apply little areas and just see how it works. Okay, so that one is the swirls. For the next one, you're going to be using your thick brush to try and control doing a shape, so a different type of brush stroke. So far we've just been going all over. This time we're trying to actually concentrate a little bit more and do a specific movement with the brush stroke, which will be press the brush down and then try and lift it up and then move it down to create this lovely wave shape. So my first one's quite pale, that's okay. I can make it a little darker as well, so that without diluting the paint too much. I'm going to make a slightly darker paint. So I'm going to start again from one end to the next, doing that. And if you dilute that down a little bit, each one will be a slightly different shade. Merged it with a bit of green there. It's very relaxing to do that, actually. Just to do that for a whole piece of paper would be quite nice, but we're just going to do this small section. And there we are. So that's just teaching you how to control the brush marks that you're making. Okay, for the next one, I'm going to do the same swirls I did before. But this time I'm just going to actually include more swirls. And you can see bits of the candle are kind of coming off. That's okay, we can just brush those off. And I might try and mix it up a bit today. I might, yeah, do the same motion I did before, just to put the colour on, see how that comes out. It's looking good. I'm going to go to my green. So it's really the variation between the different colours and the textures that kind of brings it to life. Okay, right, for the next one, we're going to be starting off slightly differently. Instead of putting some wax or pencil down first, we're just going to start off with some paint, some plain water. Yes, it is a little bit blue, but that doesn't matter for now. We can just use the plain water, put some water down first, then go to your colour. I've still got plenty left there, and just apply a band into the wet paint. You'll see it all merging across. This technique is called wet on wet painting. But you really do need quite a bit of water to start off with to get these effects going on, these bands of colour. So I've put some colour there. I'm going to get a bit of the darker. I've got some black here, I might just mix up a bit. Up there. I'm going to just put a dark band. And can you see when I add the second colour, it repels the first colour? So you're getting some interesting kind of movement there. While that's still all going on, I might just drop in a few drips of this green I've got. And while all of that is still wet, now I'm going to add the magic ingredient, which is just ordinary table salt. So I take a little pinch of that, and then I start to sprinkle that on. And if you can see what's happening, it's basically absorbing the water around it and pulling paint out, pulling pigment and paint out of that area and creating sort of an interesting texture that we've got there. Okay, so that's another couple of techniques in there, just using the salt and using water and paint together. For the next one, we're going to be using a similar effect to the one we've just done here and here. We're using the swirls of candle. And again, we're going to just cover that in a wash. I'm just varying the colour a little bit, and then we're going to add, so while this is still quite a lot of water, then I'm going to be adding some powdered instant coffee. And what I do is I pinch it like the salt, and I do try and pinch it even further, so grinding it a little bit as I'm sprinkling it on like a powder. I could also put some coffee into my palette, like here for example, and add a little bit of water to create some brown coloured ink, but I quite like just the idea of the sprinkles landing on there and kind of expanding out in terms of colour. If if I just add water to the coffee, I get slightly, because the water's already a little bit blue, it's slightly greeny, so I can add some little bits here and there. Well, this is still wet, I might just add a bit to that. Hold on. Okay. All right, so then we start to get these kind of greeny, quite deep colours and a slightly different texture where the coffee's landed. So for the final one, I'm going to combine the idea of the wavy lines, but I'm going to use wavy lines in the wax and then the bands as well. So I'm going to start off with my wavy lines. If you find it difficult to do these wavy lines because you haven't essentially got anything to look at, you could just sketch them in pencil. That's fine, you could do that first, because it is a little bit difficult to see. Okay, and then I'm going to go with some bands of water. And some bands of colour. Okay, I've put quite a lot of paint on my brush there, and that's why it's standing out more than I wanted it to, but we'll just let that settle down. Paint tends to dry a darker shade to the shade that it looks when it's wet, so it always does look different. Okay, and what I might do to this one is add a little bit of salt as well while I'm here. And now we've come to the end of our 8 watercolour and texture experiments, so we're ready to go on to our seascape painting next.